Alrighty, so we revisit our understanding here of lists, or what we call arrays, which is basically where you make a variable that can store multiple values instead of just one value. And in this assignment, I'm going to ask you to generate an algorithm, or I guess write an application that will create a list with the numbers 1 through 10. However, the numbers 1 through 10 will be stored randomly, meaning it won't be in ascending order, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 10, or descending order, 10, 9, 8. Instead, they're going to be placed randomly. And we're going to do that using a loop. So we're going to use a looping mechanism so that we can insert a random number at that index value at index 0, and then another random number at index 1, and then another random number at index 2, so on and so forth. We are going to count the number of times, the number of iterations or loops that it takes to fill up the entire array. And every time that you run this, you should get a different array. But what should be true is that you always have the numbers 1 through 10 in here. And if you look here, I do indeed have the numbers 1 through 10. None of the numbers repeat, by the way. So it took 22 tries, by the way. In this case, 22 iterations to fill up the array. If I run it one more time, again, the array changes, but it's still the numbers 1 through 10. They're not in the same order, which is obviously good because these are being stored randomly. It took 31 iterations this time to fill up the array. And once again, anytime I run it, it will still have all the numbers 1 through 10. However, they will be in different orders and it will take as many iterations. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to get started with this. So I am going to give you an idea. I'm going to include some comments to have you think your way through this problem because it is a little bit more challenging than maybe previous problems, but it's manageable. It's very doable. So let me do something here where I'm going to pause. Okay, I was just taking care of some code. So I've given you basically everything that you need here. I just placed comments and removed some of the code that I was using to implement the algorithm here to generate the array with the numbers 1 through 10 in random order, and then also print the number of iterations, the number of times it took to fill this up. So let me just walk you through it for a little bit. First here, I want you to understand that when we, on line 5, we are generating an array that has just all zeros and specifically has 10. So it's the same as writing here 0, 0, 0, all the way up to until you have 10 zeros. So it is equivalent to that, but it's a shorter way of doing it. We just say, let's put this 0 in the square brackets. That means that we're going to have an array, which is a list, and we multiply that by 10. And basically, we say, make me a list that has 10 elements and they're all zeros. Then here, index is basically the variable that we're going to use to reference an element in the array. So if I was to print, for example, right now, if I was to print rand of index, well, that index right now has a value of 0, so that would be rand of 0, which means the 0th element in rand, which happens to right now be a 0 because it's populated with zeros. Iteration is the number of times you are going to loop. Initially, it's at 0. Now, you need to start thinking about what you're going to do here. So I've given you some comments to kind of help you out. We're using a while loop as long as index is less than the number of elements. And if you don't recall, there is a way to get the number of elements in an array. So I'll write here on the Python shell, I'll make an array called y, and it's going to have just the numbers 7, 10, and 3. And if I want to figure out how many elements there are, I can do len of y, like that. And it gives me 3 because there are 3 elements in there. Not because there's a number 3, but because there are 3. And if I was to change y to have an additional 2 elements, then if I do the length of y, It tells me how many elements are in Y. There are 5 now, 5 numbers. So when I say loop as long as index is less than the number of elements in rand. I forgot that. Now there's a way to figure out how many elements there are in an array. I've written it out here. And then right here, I'm giving you instructions on line 11 to generate a random number between 1 and 10 and store it in a variable x. Now, if you don't recall how to generate a random number, you can always look it up, but you do have to import the random module, which I have done up here. To generate a random number, well, I'll have you look it up. Okay, we've done it before. Look through your code. We have generated random numbers before, a random integer to be exact. Now this line 13, it says if, so within the parentheses, we need to put a Boolean expression. Check if x is not in rand. Now this is something new, and let me talk about what that means. Say you have the list here, like I have here y. I can actually check to see if a number is in my list by saying 10 in y. Now this is going to print true or false. If 10 is in y, it will print true. If it's not, it's going to print false. Notice how it prints true because 10 is in my list. What if I do 79 in y? Well, that's false because 79 is not in y. But I can also do the following. 7 not in y, which means is 7. If it's not in y, print true. And that's false because 7 is in y. So if I do a number like 18, is 18 not in y? It's not, right? There is no 18, so this should print true. And so with that, you should do something very similar here, but now we're checking to see if x is not in the rand array. If it's not, so when you generate a random number like a random number between 1 and 10, so let's say you generate a 9. If 9, so 9 will be stored in x. If 9 is not in rand, which it won't be because it's full of zeros, then I want to store x at the next index location in rand. What I mean by that, when we populate an array like y of 0, if I put y of 0 equals 81, and then I print y, notice that I've stored 81 at the 0th element. Remember that indexing starts at 0. If I do y of 3 equals 56, then the third element, which is starting at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, is now equal to 56. So I've stored 56 in there. And that's what I mean right here. Store whatever x is at the next index location in rand. Meaning, remember that index is going to start at 0. And then after that, increment index by 1. Because when we do this again, we want to store it in the next location. Finally, out of the if statement, because this is only going to execute sometimes, it's going to execute if the random number x is not already in the rand. Afterwards, we want to increment the variable iteration by 1, because that's going to keep track of how many times we looped. How many tries did it take to fill up the array? In this case, if you recall from my previous run, it took 18 iterations. That means we had to run the loop 18 times to get this to fill up. That's because, say you put a 10 in there and you loop and you generate a 10 again. You don't want to put a 10 again in here because you already have a 10. So you don't store anything, you loop again and you generate a 6. And there's no 6 in my array, so you put in the 6 and you're looping and looping. So there's going to be times when you perform an iteration, but you already have that number in your array, so you don't want to store it in there again. And so that's why this number is going to be bigger than 10. So it's not going to take 10 tries Maybe if you're really lucky, it might take 10 tries to fill this up. It usually will take more than that because um, when you generate a random number and try to store it in the array, that number might already be in the array, which is why we're doing this check right here. So again, a little bit more of a challenging problem, but hopefully what I've gone over here can help you with the assignment.